The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Give us just a moment as we get the screens ready and get the presentation going.
Jennifer, this is Karen. Can you confirm my seeing the slides?
I can. I'm actually seeing them. I believe. Let me open and see what if I can see what the audience is seeing. I think I'm seeing them in the. There we go. Perfect. All right, so I have all the slides up. Thank you, everyone, today for joining us. I'd like to introduce Greg Core from the Department of Ed.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and welcome. First of all, happy Valentine's Day. Don't forget that, and welcome to OSEP's February National TA Call. We have a great presentation lined up for you today, but before we start that, I wanted to begin with a few announcements. If you're in a state office, you're probably very much aware that the APRs did arrive on February 1st. We want to thank all of you for the time and effort that you put into those submissions. We are on the road to reviewing those. Individual state leads are doing kind of the first cut, and then we'll go from there. The SSIP indicators B17 and C11 are staggered as they have been and not due until April 1st. So we know that you're likely shifting your analyze those documents so that those will be ready by the April 1st submission date. So as you continue that work, feel free to reach out to your state lead if you have any questions. I want to also announce that Part C grant applications are due May 3rd, which seems like a long way off, but that's particularly important because in order to meet the 60-day public participation requirement, they will have to be posted by March 3rd. So that's coming up very soon, Hal. If you need TA prior to preparing your applications, again, your state lead is available to help you with any questions that you have. A couple other announcements. The Early Childhood TA Centers finalized the 2019 state TA opportunities. It was sent out on their listserv this past Monday. So I hope that you got that. If not, you might want to check your cluttered email to see if it ended up there. It's also been posted to all of the Early Childhood Center web pages, another place you can look. The 2019 OSEP Leadership Conference will be held on July 22nd through 24th. The submission deadline for proposals is Friday, March 1st, so another date that's approaching very quickly. We'll be receiving those, accepting those up through 5 o'clock on that date. We look forward to your participation at the Leadership Conference this year. We do want to make you aware that because of changes in funding cycles of some of our TA centers, that the levels of support for state travel will not be the same as they've been in past years. Okay, so let's then move to the presentation. Today's TA call is co-led by two of our centers, the State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices Center, which is a mouthful. We like to call it CSEP, and the National Center for Systemic Improvement, NCSI. The moderator for today's call will be Jennifer Coffey from our Research Practice Division. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. This is Jennifer Coffey, and as Greg said, I am the project officer for CSEP. I'm also the program lead for the State Personnel Development Grants Program, so you may already know me through that. So I wanted to give you a little background as to why we're here today and why our speakers have joined us. And specifically, I'm going to start way back with why we started to support implementation science. And the big why, the big reason was to build capacity. There were a lot of calls for states to build capacity to support implementation of evidence-based practices, but there wasn't a lot of evidence about how to go about doing so. And implementation science for OSEP filled that void. Next slide. So a little background on education research. I'm sure you're fairly aware, but there were many investments in interventions, but not a lot of investment about how to support implementation of those interventions. Even less investment in how to sustain those interventions, and even less in how to scale up those interventions. And so OSEP began thinking through how can we support states in building this capacity, and specifically we put out a notice in 2007 for a TA center that would ensure that the implementation of evidence-based practices that improve the achievement of students with disabilities is sustained and brought to scale for grades K through 12. And so this, again, was 2007, so 12 years ago, and the center became CSEP. And CSEP's method of implementation science is called the Active Implementation Framework, so that's their model. And the Active Implementation Frameworks provide this formula for success, that when you have effective practices and you support those with effective implementation, and you have enabling context, so the organization, the administrative support, the database decision-making are all there to support the implementation, then you will get improved outcomes. And this should be true of any setting, early intervention or school-based setting. Next slide. Statewide infrastructure is necessary for that formula of success to take place. And so CSEP has gone about helping states build the infrastructure, starting at the state team, going down to regional, district, and all the way to the building implementation team. And so this has been extremely challenging work. If you've been working on creating infrastructure with CSEP, or if you've been working on your own, it is probably the most challenging thing you can do. I've heard Cesar de Gore compare this to rocket science, and I don't think he's wrong in that. Next slide. I wanted to talk about how OSEP has integrated implementation science to other areas of our work. So of course we have the TA Center, but we have also integrated it into the SPDIG and the SEP. And those are just two examples. Our technology investments have integrated implementation science, our inclusion investment. So it goes much beyond this, but these two examples, the SPDIG and the SEP, I think, are most relevant to your work. And with the SPDIG, we've taken the implementation drivers from the Active Implementation Framework, and we've created effective professional development systems. And when I say we, it's really a royal we. You have created effective professional development systems. And you've determined what the program, intervention, practice, evidence-based practices, and you've determined how to measure its fidelity. And of course, this has also been true with your SEP work. And you can see here that in phase 2, OSEP called for attention to research on implementation, and it's really been integrated throughout the SEP work. So, of course, implementation science, and specifically the active implementation frameworks, are not the only way to go about building capacity. We realize that. And as other approaches come up in education, we have to ask the question, how does everything fit together? How can we support this work? And specifically, today we're going to talk about improvement science and how that fits with implementation science. So here in the active implementation frameworks, you can see that usable innovation, so what is the what? What's the intervention? How we support effective implementation, and that's by thinking through the implementation stages and supporting that work, the implementation drivers, and then in the enabling context, we have implementation teams, and you see on the bottom right, we have improvement cycles. And so improvement science, which Rory Fitzpatrick from NCSI is going to describe at greater length today, is doing a great job of pulling out this idea of improvement and taking a closer look at it, putting it into practice, and we're learning a lot about what that improvement should look like. One of the big reasons for having this webinar is because improvement science and implementation science, I've heard a few times people talking about it as an either or. question. And really it's both and. You can see improvement cycles as part of the active implementation framework. And so our speakers today are going to tell you a little bit more how that can all work together. And so today we have from NCSI, we have Rory Fitzpatrick. We also have Michelle Rovens with us, and she will be monitoring the chat. We have from CSEP, Kathleen Ryan Jackson and Karen Ward. And from Kentucky, Amanda Waldrop. And in Kentucky, they are actively working on that infrastructure. We talked about how difficult it was. And Amanda is their state transformation specialist. So she is on the ground seeing what this looks like every day. And she's using implementation science and improvement science to do this work. And in addition to that, I just wanted to mention that the Carnegie Foundation provided an award to Kentucky for their work in CSEP as well. I don't know if that was in the slides, so I want to make sure everyone knew. So I will go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Jennifer, so much. This is Rory Fitzpatrick. I am the director of the National Center for Systemic Improvement at WestEd, and I'm happy to talk to you today to, in part, kind of help dispel this myth that it's improvement science versus implementation science, and really help us all get just another step clearer on how these two bodies of research fit together. So with that said, in a second, I'll talk a little bit about the specific goals for today. Before I do that, let me just note that if you are logged into the webinar on the GoToMeeting platform, there's a little tab at the bottom called Handouts. So you'll see a place for attendees and audio and webcam and all that stuff. The little bottom caret called Handouts, if you click there, you can download the attachments from today, which include the PowerPoint slides, along with an infographic that's a one-pager with it's chock full of information about how improvement science and implementation science fit together. If you're not logged into the webinar and you're just participating by phone, Jennifer Reed, our good colleague who organizes these calls in terms of the technology, is going to automatically send them out to your email address for everybody who's participating, either logged in or otherwise. So you can grab those if you want to, or you can plan for them to come your way and do with them as you will. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, let's just point briefly to the goals for today. So as Jennifer Coffey really well laid out, we're going to talk about these two important bodies of research, implementation science and improvement science. And in particular, we're going to spend some time looking at their commonalities and how they dovetail together. We want to note that both these sciences lean hard on data-driven continuous improvement, and they both underscore the importance of such in any improvement process you're undertaking. In a minute, we'll talk about the varied works that you might be doing. Some of you are committed to improvement science, some of you are committed to implementation science, some a combination, some other things. At NCSI, we laughingly call ourselves the O-positive continuous improvement approach. We want to meet you wherever you are, and we pull from these bodies of research to really help you in those efforts, all of which are data-driven. We're also, really importantly, grateful to Kathleen and to Amanda, who, as Jennifer said, are going to share a little bit about a Kentucky example, because we think that's going to help make it kind of real. We'll note that the example is about the work of a Part B state education agency, in this case Kentucky, and it's focused on math. But the concepts that Amanda and Kathleen are going to talk about are really transferable across contexts. So for example, you can generalize these lessons and ideas to other age spans, like infants and toddlers, to secondary students, and to different focused areas. So while they're focused on math, you could translate this to literacy or social and emotional outcomes or anything kind of along that line. So in a second, we'll turn to a poll. Before that, let me just say that in the GoToMeeting platform, there is a chat function. It's one of those little down-facing carrots, and if at any time you want to pop questions or comments into the chat, please do so. Because of the function of the system, not all participants will be able to see the chat, but for that reason, we've got my good friend and colleague, Michelle Rovens from NCSI, who's helping us moderate that chat. So feel free to use the chat function, even if you're not sure that others are going to see it. We'll help manage that for you. So with that, let's turn to a poll. To set the stage, so you can go ahead and move, Karen, to the next slide. To set the stage for, I guess the poll isn't a slide. So to set the stage for our learning today, let's just get a perspective on how your state is approaching the implementation of your state systemic improvement plan. We would love you to respond to this polling question. Which systemic change processes or methods do you use to implement your state systemic improvement plan? We want you to check all that apply. We've given you choices of implementation science and active implementation frameworks, improvement science, deliverology, an other method that's not listed here, or maybe you're not using any specific change process process or methods. So we'd invite you to check all that apply of there. You won't be able to see the poll, but I'll provide some real-time updates as folks are checking. So I see that the poll is in progress for attendees at this point. I don't see any data yet. Jennifer, if there's a place I should be seeing data, that's not happening. So maybe people aren't filling out the poll yet.
We have had, so far, 45% of people have voted. 88% have said implementation science and active implementation frameworks. 25% are at improvement science. 4% at deliverology, 3% at other methods, and 12% at not using any specific change process at this time. So it's still climbing a little bit. We're up to about 60% voted. So we'll give it just a few more seconds, so don't forget to vote.
All right, we'll just give it about 5 more seconds and then we'll move forward.
And we ended at about the same, 85% at implementation science, 23% are now at improvement science, 5% at deliverology, 4% at other methods, and 14% not using anything at this time.
All right, thanks. So that's a nice kind of spool up. Many of you are familiar with implementation science. A good quarter of you are familiar with improvement science and using it, and then we've got some others. And again, not surprising that almost 15% say they're not using any specific change process because you might be using a combination. So with that, we know that there are a number of different paths to systemic improvement, right? And we wanted to call out that, you know, there's not necessarily a best answer here. There's a best answer for what's right in the context of your state, but we really know that we can pull from the research to guide our efforts. So we're really going to hone down on 2, improvement science and implementation science with that in place today. And towards that end, we want to focus largely on the commonalities and complements across them. So I'm going to hand it over to my good friend and colleague, Karen Ward, to talk us through the complements and common tenets. Go for it, Karen.
Thanks so much, Rory. So as Rory said, we want to talk through the common tenets across these 2 sciences. To be able to do that, the SysUp team, along with our colleagues at NCSI, stepped back and kind of did a literature analysis to really be able to pull these to the forefront of what are these common tenets and principles that we see going across. So I'm going to talk through each of these. Again, there's more information in the infographic if you're able to download that today or when you receive it. So take a look at them, and we hope we have this handy because we do get questions at times. For example, from you all. I got an email from a State Department a week ago saying, hey, our other offices at our agency are looking at improvement science. We've been using implementation science. Can you tell us how these go together or not? And so our hope today is to be able to list what those common tenets are and for you to have a resource in your back pocket that you can use going forward if you encounter similar conversations. So let's look at the first couple common tenets here. One is that they both use teaming structures. Now you're going to see there's different language that that are used, but let's focus on the function that's being referenced. So improvement science uses networked improvement communities, and implementation science uses the term linked implementation teams. Both types of teams are guided by an understanding of the problem or need, the theory of action or change, and they both use data in cycles of improvement. Both types of teams also prioritize the voice of the end user, our staff, our leaders in the planning and the problem solving as well. So that's our first common tenet. A second one is a focus on the use of a variety of data sources. We often see a heavy emphasis on the use of outcome data to help us determine our impact. But both improvement and implementation science utilize data related to process, fidelity, context, and other organizational factors, as well as stakeholder input to drive problem solving and decision making, and really are helpful in guiding our implementation and continuous improvement processes. Our third common tenet is that both sciences are very much system focused. Improvement science provides routines for examining factors that contribute to the problem, such as those outside of the individual. And implementation science focuses on building and refining the infrastructure through organizational alignment and use of those implementation drivers we heard Jennifer Coffey reference earlier to ensure a system of support for the effective use of the practice. We have 3 more common tenets for you. The next one is they both use improvement cycles. We heard both Rory and Jennifer reference this. Both sciences utilize the plan, do, study, act cycle of improvement. Both are asking 3 fundamental questions. What is it we're trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is improvement? And what change can we make that will result in improvement? PDSA cycles are used by both sciences for an improving an innovation or a practice, improving the implementation supports for that practice, as well as improving the organization and the system context that that practice is residing within. One of our favorites here at SISEP, and it's a common tenet across those sciences, is starting small and studying in varied contexts. So both sciences propose starting small and getting better, and using PDSA cycles to test the implementation or the improvements before expansion or scaling. Again, we see a little difference in terminology, but the function is the same here. Improvement science uses improvement projects, and implementation sciences uses the methodology of a transformation zone. Both methods are means of building capacity, refining the intervention or the practice, and creating readiness before going to scale. And then our final common tenet is a focus on the practitioner-driven problem or need. We often see that there's a jump from selection to adoption of a solution to trying to use it. In both of these sciences, there's an emphasis on a systemic selection of the innovation or the solution. In improvement science, there's direct involvement of different types of users and identifying what improvement science calls high leverage problems and solutions. In implementation science, the selection of the innovations is also based on identified need and fit of the innovation to the local context, as well as directly engaging those practitioners and other stakeholders in the process of doing so. So we see these 6 common tenets across the 2 sciences. We're going to talk a little bit more about implications for our work, but before we do so, we really want to highlight what do these look like in action when they're being used together. And to that end, I'm very pleased to introduce Kathleen Ryan-Jackson, one of my fellow colleagues here at SISEP, and Amanda Waldrop from Kentucky, who's going to share their story in using both sciences to produce systemic change. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen and Amanda.
Thank you, Karen. So Kentucky's improvement story began back in 2014, and that followed a rigorous exploration process with the SISEP team. At the time, Kentucky still does acknowledge that there is a research to practice gap, where high-quality research is seldom translated into effective practice in a variety of unique contexts. So Kentucky believed if implementation and improvement science were married to develop people and measures and routines, they would improve outcomes. So on the next slide, we can see how Kentucky set off to build an implementation and improvement infrastructure. And so I'll wait for the slide to advance. Perfect, thank you. So a team with diverse roles and perspectives from across the state of Kentucky designed a usable innovation, or what they would expect to see in any mathematics classroom, regardless of the teacher's unique craft. Then they designed the training, coaching, and data infrastructure, or how they would do the work. Finally, they created an enabling context, or how teams would use data monthly. This process took 2 years to develop, and it fundamentally changed the way administrators, teachers, and school staff were supported. In their 3rd year, they began to produce educationally significant outcomes and close disparities in special education outcomes and other underrepresented populations. So as you can see, this is a multiplication problem. And if one component is 0, then the outcome is 0. And in Kentucky, we learned early on that we were going to have to go slow so the districts and their schools could go fast. Next slide.
So in Kentucky, from a statewide perspective, what we needed to do was rapid development. We needed to incubate quite a bit and fail forward with some ideas, with a structure in mind of school, district, region, and state to ensure sustainability and that the onus was no longer on the teacher. Next slide, please. So our vehicle was our state systemic improvement plan. We first conducted a data and infrastructure analysis with a diverse team of stakeholders, and we found that 80% of students with disabilities were not proficient in middle school mathematics. So our state identified measurable result is first to reduce novice performance in middle school math, because we know we have to do this before we can reach our ultimate goal of increasing proficiency for students with disabilities. We're focusing on improving outcomes for students with disabilities in the elementary and middle school general education setting, because since 2009, Kentucky's least restrictive environment for 80% or more of the day in the general education setting has been over 70%. And we know that math is cumulative. We wanted to include both the elementary and middle school levels. We continued to dive deeper into our data, and we looked at a statewide teacher survey to get their perspective. They had voiced that they needed professional development on differentiating instruction and supporting students with disabilities. However, as Kathleen had mentioned, there's often an implementation and improvement gap. So as a result, we set a goal to train and coach networked implementation teams to use implementation and outcome data and plan to do study act cycles for continuous improvement. Next slide, please. So to begin working on our state-identified measurable result, we developed a learning laboratory or a transformation zone within a vertical slice of our state system, region, district, and school, because research suggests that we can't change everything at once. We had to start small in a variety of contexts in 2 regions, 5 districts, 7 schools, and with 44 teachers, including large urban and rural districts, so everyone could see their own unique context. We tested the infrastructure in this vertical slice of the state and refined the process, making modifications along the way and based on practice and feedback data. This intentional process ensured with a high degree of confidence that we could replicate and scale the process in the second learning laboratory or transformation zone more efficiently and at a faster pace to create a collective commitment to continuous improvement. Next slide, please.
So implementation teams in Kentucky's first learning laboratory are linked with what we call strong communication protocols. So feedback and data from teachers is fed up monthly to the team with the authority and the resources to remove barriers that impede their progress. And also, we focus on replicating and sustaining what is working. So the goal ultimately is for policy to sustain effective practice. And what this does is develop this collective commitment, as Amanda talked about, to continuous improvement. Because when a person or team expresses a need, that voice is acknowledged and action is taken. Or in the words of a family advocate in Kentucky, everyone can see that they have a role to play. So as you can imagine, developing high-functioning implementation teams at every level of the system requires intensive implementation-informed support. And this includes monthly on-site visits and ongoing virtual coaching from the SISIP team. We apply an I do, we do, you do methodology as teams at the state and the region develop the capacity to support districts and their schools. Kentucky's regional educational cooperatives are the critical liaisons between schools and the state. And SISIP is the critical liaison to our federal program officers, because eventually we want federal policy to enhance effective practice in schools. In Kentucky, we're currently exploring the integration of networked improvement community attributes with our linked implementation team structure. Our hypothesis is when implementation teams are networked so that they can learn from one another regularly, we can increase their capacity and the state capacity to scale more effectively and efficiently each time. Next slide.
In Kentucky, we use a nonlinear stage-based process because researchers found that typically organizations often adopt a practice and skip straight to initial implementation, only to abandon the practice because it was not used effectively. So in Kentucky, we wanted to change that narrative. So what we did first was began an exploration where a diverse team of stakeholders came together to assess the fit and feasibility of a usable innovation. They looked at the research on mathematics instruction to clearly define and operationalize what does high quality math instruction look like in the classroom. From there, we went into an installation where diverse teams co-created training, coaching, and data system measures. And what we were looking at was training on the evidence-based practices delivered effectively. Were teachers receiving coaching on the evidence-based practices, and was it effective? Was data use effective? Next, we moved into initial implementation, where teachers are using the evidence-based practice and teams are using plan, do, study, act cycles monthly with implementation data to remove barriers and support teachers. In Kentucky, it took us 2 years to develop the infrastructure to support teachers, and we've been in initial implementation where teachers are using the evidence-based practices for a little over a year. We have a district within the learning laboratory or transformation zone that is close to full implementation, and that's where 80% of the district schools are using the evidence-based practices as intended and are achieving improved student outcomes. And so under optimal conditions, when executive leaders are visible and resources are adequate, we can expect it to take 3 to 6 years to reach full implementation. Next slide, please.
So beginning in 2014, implementation teams began measuring their capacity to engage in deep systemic change. So now this slide is complex, but I think we can walk through it. So you can see at the bottom of the slide, they do this every 6 months, each team. And you can see the percent of their total score out of 100 on the y-axis, the year 1 goal of 60% in gold, and the year 3 goal of 80% in gray. So baseline scores at every level are typically very low as teams really begin to study how to use implementation science. I want you to note the blue trend line representing the state capacity assessment scores. So Kentucky's baseline was very low, 19%. Then within 1 year, the state exceeded the 1-year goal of 60%. Then I want you to note that their scores dipped to 52% on the 4th assessment, and we really feel that that was due to the administrative turnover at the time. And it also suggests to us that the measure is going to be sensitive to change as we go forward. By the 5th administration, the state was within 4% of meeting the year 3 goal of 80%. Now I want you to take a look at the trajectory of the region in purple. You'll see it's much steeper as they develop the capacity of their districts. And then district growth in turquoise is usually steady, but often slower as they prepare to use their chosen mathematics innovation in schools. Now look at the school's trajectory in green. It is so rapid, from 31% at baseline to 67% at their 2nd administration, and that is within 6 months. So the capacity of the teams at the state, the region, and the district in Kentucky paid really big dividends for their schools in the form of ongoing training, coaching, and data use for continuous improvement. I really want to draw your attention to the state's 4th data point. Notice that, that when the state's total score dipped to 52%, the total scores of the regions, districts, and schools were not affected. So that suggests to us that they're building the systems and capacity for use of the schools, the district's chosen math innovation, and that these systems are durable and have promise for sustainability. In 2015, schools began collecting fidelity data, and they use this data to improve training and coaching supports for teachers monthly. So our hypothesis is, if capacity increases, so should fidelity. And if fidelity increases, so should student outcomes. Next slide.
So the first learning laboratory district with repeated capacity and fidelity data showed an increase in the percent of students meeting proficiency in math in the participating middle and elementary school. Using a math screening measure 3 times per year, 21.5% of students were proficient in the fall of 2017, increasing to 38.5% in the winter of 2018, and up to 51% in the spring of 2018, a 29.5% increase. And so proximal data, that is the closest to the student, is always the first data to suggest students are improving. And so the question would be, could we replicate this and continue to improve proximal data? And if so, how long would it take us to see a change in the distal end-of-year state summative assessment data? And so typically it takes 3 to 5 years. Next slide, please. So Kentucky State Assessment has 4 scales: novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished. And we acknowledge that we have to decrease novice before we can increase apprentice and then proficient. Summative data suggests that we are moving these data as well. For students with disabilities, novice reduced by 5.7%, 2 times the rate of comparable schools within the district. And you can see a notable decrease in novice performance in other subpopulations as well, including African American, free and reduced lunch, and Hispanic. And so this is preliminary evidence of meeting our first initial goal of reducing novice performance. Next slide, please.
Hey, Amanda and Kathleen. There's a question in the chat asking, can someone please explain for the listeners what exactly is captured in the capacity assessment? Some may not know what that tool is intended to measure and how it's used at different intervals. Its use at different intervals can be informative. So would one of you mind talking to a little bit about that capacity assessment?
Do you want me to take it, Amanda, or would you like to?
Sure, go ahead, Kathleen.
So the capacity assessments measure the drivers. Jennifer talked about the drivers, and they also measure stage-based work. Throughout the assessments, you will see the 5 active implementation frameworks also pop up, but what we measure are the drivers. So do we have selection criteria in place? Are we selecting the right people? Do we have training systems in place? Are we measuring them? Do we have coaching systems in place? Are we measuring them? And are we measuring fidelity of implementation? So that would be the left side of the drivers, competency. On the right side, are we measuring our organization? First of all, a decision support data system. Are we using multiple forms of data regularly, using plan, do, study, act cycles? Are we solving problems at the level that we're at? So as a school, can a school implementation team or a building implementation team solve their problems and provide the resources and supports that their staff and teachers need to be successful? If not, they lift it up and engage in what's called systems intervention to the team with the authority to solve that problem. So that's that linked teaming framework where we feed problems up the system and then feedback solutions. So that's what we're measuring in the capacity. Karen, would you like to add anything?
No, that covered it well. Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah.
I think the other question in the chat, the part 2 to that, was how is it used at different intervals? So I don't know, Kathleen, if you just, or Amanda, want to talk to the use of that data to inform the action planning.
Yeah. So that really does, depending on their stage of work, right, or the intervals, Amanda, it really does drive what the action plans are, because you can't do it all at once, and teams have to be ready. So depending on the team's readiness, they determine through support through SISUP and coaching what the next right step would be. Is there anything you want to add, Amanda, in reference to the action planning process and how we use the data?
No, I think you covered it. really, it's like you said, it's not doing everything at once. It's kind of biting off a little bit at a time to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to support the use of evidence-based practices.
And I think in Kentucky, they're able to use the data because they have a data dashboard. So if they're looking at their training and coaching data and see the need for improvement, they'll also often go back to their capacity assessment and see how they scored those items around coaching and training, and then possibly have to lift it up to a team at another level who has the resources to solve their problem.
While we're stopped, there's a couple more questions. What's the N size of actual students?
So the N size, are you referring to this slide that's showing up right now?
Possibly.
So within this slide, this is one school. So this is about 150 students. In the previous slide, it was 2 schools. So I would say that's approximately, I would say about, I don't have the number right in front of me, but I'm just estimating about 800. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm just kind of guessing.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
That was exactly what they were asking. So one more question. What assessment is being used for student outcomes? Is it the Kentucky summative assessment or another interim assessment like MAP?
Okay, so the proximal data that showed in this slide, it depends on what the district is using. So this particular assessment that's displayed in here is iReady. We have some districts that use MAP. So this particular one is iReady. So it really depends on what the district is using as far as their screener. And then the next slide is our state summative assessment, which is KPREP, is what it's referred to as. Any other questions?
One other question just came in about, do you know if the Kentucky process would work with smaller N sizes, such as 40 or so?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, certainly. And we're actually within our transformation zone. We are working within different size districts. We have some large urban districts. We have small districts that may only have a few hundred students. So the process that we've been using and we've been talking about through our work with OSEP can absolutely be applied to any size school or district.
I'd also add, Amanda, that you're applying the lessons learned from implementation also at the state level and aligning your departments using the work of implementation and improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true. Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, it can apply to anything.
Yes, certainly. So should we move on to the next slide and look a little bit more at the data? So this slide here, so the other components of our state identified measurable result is to increase proficiency. So in only 1 year, once the infrastructure was in place, initial evidence from the state summative math data and the first learning laboratory or transformation zone school that had the entire infrastructure and system in place suggests that all students increased proficiency from 2007 to 2018 by about 3.7%. And 2 subpopulations showed growth as well. Students with disabilities increased 0.3% and African American students increased 3.9%. And so the question would be, can we sustain or continue to improve the summative math data in 2019? And so our hypothesis is yes, because we have networked improvement teams that take responsibility for providing training and coaching to teachers on effective practices and improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And so as a teacher in our transformation zone or learning laboratory so eloquently said, we're beginning to get data linking outcomes to use. Next slide, please.
And so as you can imagine, we have many, many lessons that we've learned, but we'd like to share a couple with you. First, we learned the importance of using one thing only really well with a high degree of fidelity so we can study the process and then scale it more effectively and efficiently. And so what this meant in Kentucky was that we had to engage diverse teams at every level of the system from day one forward, so the people could co-create the implementation and improvement infrastructure. It was important that everybody needed to see themselves in the work. And Amanda, I think you can agree, when we did this with Fidelity, we had widespread buy-in. And when we didn't, we had to return to the exploration stage. And what's been so fun in Kentucky is you'll often hear them say, in Kentucky, exploration, pay now or pay later. So that's always fun to walk into a meeting and hear folks say that, and you know that they've looked at some data and they're going to go back to a previous stage to strengthen a stage-based activity. Then, scale the process again and again more effectively and efficiently. And now we apply that proven process again and again, each time more efficiently from one region to the next, one district to the next, and one school to the next, until ultimately we transform the state and policy sustains effective practice. So we want to leave you with one important thing to understand that we found, and that is that implementation and improvement are adaptive and messy by nature, but that is where the magic of continuous improvement happens. So thank you from Amanda and I for your attention.
This is Rory. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Kathleen. Yeah, couldn't agree more. You've given us some really nice things to think about. I think I'm kind of reacting to, that's where the magic happens, right? So the magic happens because the science is good. So let's talk a little bit about the connections across this work. Karen and I were thinking that it would be useful to just kind of pop up some whole arching questions that might resonate with the group. And because of the platform of, there's so many people being on once, we're going to kind of ask and answer these questions and encourage you to pop your thoughts into the chat. And then we'll leave you with some reflective questions for your teams to go back and talk about in your own context. But this first one, we get asked a lot, when continuous improvement efforts are working well, what are some of the reasons why? And what we want to talk about is a couple of things. So as both our centers are lucky enough to work with states across the country, we see that those that are succeeding are concentrating on each important element in the systems change process. And you heard Amanda and Kathleen talk through how they approach that in Kentucky. So drawing upon what they said, we know that they and other states that are succeeding are paying attention to collecting and using relevant data to assess progress and inform decision making, right? We heard Kathleen a minute ago talk about pay now or pay later, and that's because they're listening to and looking at their data and making data-informed decisions. We also know that when improvements efforts are working well, it's because the stakeholders in the process are intentional about supporting quality implementation of evidence-based practices. We're leaning not only on the science of how to implement and improve and scale up, but we have to be leaning on the evidence around what the innovation is that you want to scale. So in this case, what were the mathematics practices that educators needed to be leaning hard on in their classrooms? We also know that success comes when there's intentional focus on aligning systems to ensure that resources and policy promote desired results, and that they accomplish this work through active and authentic stakeholder engagement, right? This piece about communicating and collaborating with individuals at various junctures of the system, both internal to the agency in this case, and external to the agency. Really, improvement work takes a commitment of all of those who are affected by the system to be implementing and scaling the work that is improving the system. And then finally, an important note is that, when this goes well, there's a focus on each of these pieces all of the time. Yet there has to be a shift to more or less focus to each piece as context demands. So in other words, not all of the elements all of the time with the same intensity, but all of those elements have to be present all of the time. This focus on data use, this intentional use of evidence-based practices, these thinking about the systems change context for policy and resource deployment, and the partnership with communication and collaboration. So at NCSI, those are things that we see routinely when the improvement efforts are working well, and Karen's going to provide a little more context about how she thinks that she can expand upon that from a NERN perspective or a CISIP perspective.
Thanks, Rory. When I think about keys to ensuring that the improvement efforts are working well, as we see it as having support similar for those efforts in addition to the supports that we see for evidence-based practices. We heard these in Kentucky. So for example, we all know engaged leadership who promotes and supports the use of an evidence-based practice is critical. Well, we see that engaged leadership who promotes and supports the use of the improvement methods or the implementation methods that are being used is also key. Also having training and coaching in the improvement and the implementation practices. We heard this from Kathleen and Amanda about the technical assistance and the training and the ongoing on-site visits and the virtual support is so critical to being able to do that. And then I think another key piece is, and Kathleen hit this well at the end, and Rory, you've spoken to it well, as well as being willing to learn and get messy, rolling up our sleeves and using that trial and learning approach versus approaching it as a trial and error. So that kind of brings us to the next question of what are some challenges to using these shared practices in state systemic work. And Rory and I wanted to kind of talk to this question as from what we see in our partnership with our states and working closely with them, or as we like to say, shoulder to shoulder in this work. So some of the challenges we often encounter is being able to stay focused on maintaining the attention in the context of all the various competing demands that we experience on an everyday basis, whether those are coming from legislature, from leadership, or from others. Another challenge is making sure we're keeping leadership staff engaged and supported, given the time it takes to show the outcomes. We hear that it's not show me the money, but show me the outcomes, and it's how do we create value for other data and other information on the way to getting that impact on outcomes that we're all so anxious and wanting to receive for our students and our families that we serve. Another challenge is, and I think NCSI shared some great data on this at the last OSEP Project Directors Conference this summer, is managing the turnover that happens at all levels, turnovers within the state agency, at the region, district, and school level, and the implications that it has for when we're building capacity. We've learned some lessons around how important it is to build redundant capacity to be able to address that turnover. Another challenge we see is access to timely and relevant data and asking the right questions of the data, especially with that equity lens that we're all paying so key attention to right now. It took time for Kentucky to build their dashboard and provide the information that was needed at the right level, at the right time, and for the right people at the system. And finally, before I turn it over to Rory to address her thoughts on this, is it just naming that the use of these improvement and implementation methods, I'm sure many of us have experienced, is it's a culture shift organizationally. So we have to be prepared to address drift and really think strategically about how we create readiness in other offices internally to our agency, as well as within your local agencies, your local school districts and schools that you're supporting. So Rory, do you want to expand upon that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think you've hit so many important nails on the head. The only thing I guess I'd say is that, with all these moving parts in play, it's really easy to see how the work can backslide, right? And I think it was Kathleen said it earlier, I can't remember, about how long this work can take. And Jennifer at the beginning of the webinar talked about that this is some of the hardest work that can be undertaken, right? So it's easy to see how it can backslide without a lot of intentionality. And towards that end, I guess I would just offer that, both CISIP and NCSI think it's noteworthy that having some sort of framework for systems improvement can help. Think about the pull back, right? So there was almost nobody who was using nothing. There were people who were using something that wasn't named here, or were using a lot. People were focusing on implementation science, and people were focusing on improvement science. But we know, given our work across states, that there are pressures from lots of directions that can shape the degree to which you can commit to one or more specific systemic improvement approaches. So with that, I think one of the key things we want to leave you with today is that if your state isn't focusing just on one single body of science or can't commit to a given framework in its specificity, you can really lean hard on these common tenets that are articulated in implementation and improvement science to help you with your thinking. And so Karen's going to talk a little bit more about how those common tenets can come into play, if you're not necessarily using implementation or improvement science practices. And I'll just remind you that infographic that you've got as a handout and either for download here or coming to you after the webinar ends has those nice kind of neat sound bites that Karen was describing earlier. So if you couldn't quite take notes as fast as we were moving, please lean hard on that infographic because it's going to underscore the content here. So Karen, you want to kind of unpack those a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think it's looking to see if we're not using either of these sciences right now, how can you take those common tenets, such as using and having a team that's accountable for the work, whether it's a network community or another, and take that system focus, the use of improvement cycles. Look to see, are those reflected in your systemic change processes that you use as an agency? And if they are, fantastic. If they're not, and you're not satisfied with how your processes are working for systemic improvement, ask yourself, how could you incorporate those tenets that make sense given your state needs and your local contacts? We can't ignore local contacts. So figuring out where can you start and what best matches where you are currently. We often focus on identifying the gaps or needs for the practices, or what we like to call the what here at SysUp, but it's also important to step back and identify the gaps or the needs and our methods for delivering those practices, or what we like to call the how.
Yeah, you know, that makes me think, Karen, the folks at the Carnegie Foundation call this seeing your system, which I think really works, right? You've got to understand all the parts of the system and the system as a whole. So it's paying attention to the ways your system is designed so you can think about what might need to change to get to the results you want. And of course, implementation and improvement science dovetail right in there, right? To guide you through processes to plan, do, study, and act, as we saw in the Kentucky example. So in our last minute and a half, with that in mind, what are some key things to consider in use of these practices?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this really short so we can share our reflective questions for the team and turn it back to Greg to close us out in the last minute and a half. My best things to consider is start small and get better, even in the use of these practices. Think about setting realistic timelines, and I just want to leave you with a piece of data. A recent meta-analysis back in 2014 showed only 7% of organizations actually engaged in all 5 steps of a plan, do, study, act cycle. So even PDSA cycles need implementation support. This is messy work, has been said several times, and remember, we're changing heart, mind, and behavior. So Rory, I'm going to turn it back to you to kind of wrap this up.
Sounds great. So let's go to the last slide and just say that there's been a lot of conversation here today and lessons learned. We wanted to leave you with these reflective questions that your teams can hit back at the ranch, as they say here in the West. So thank you very much for this opportunity for NCSI and for SysUp to try to provide some support in this webinar. And as you know, both centers are deeply committed to supporting you on the ground in the work, so don't hesitate to reach out. There's some resources at the back end of the slide deck available on these websites, including the PowerPoint and the infographic. And with that, back to Greg, and thank you so much for this opportunity to help.
Thank you, and we're closing out the hour here, but before we do, I want to express my appreciation to our partners at NCSI and CSEP for this presentation. Certainly a lot to think about, and we really enjoyed hearing the experiences of our colleagues out in Kentucky and the success that they've had. I want to thank Jennifer Coffey, here, our project officer for CSEP, for bringing this call together, bringing everyone together on this call, and announce that next month we have another call lined up. It will also be on the 14th, March 14th, Thursday, and we'll be featuring the new U.S. Department of Education English Language Resource Guide, which was issued about a month ago. Tips on how to implement requirements of ESSA as they apply to English language learners. We'll be sending out more information about that as the date of the call approaches. So we will close out, and also wanted to express my appreciation to Jennifer Reed for doing such a great job here today of making this all happen for us. Take care and have a great Valentine's Day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending today's event.